Christmas on the High Seas by Robert Button. It was a crisp, clear day when the British frigate, the HMS Renown, sailed out of Portsmouth, England, bound for Australia. The Renown and her captain, Sir Henry Goforth, had made the trip many times. The only thing different about this trip was that it began at the height of the winter season. December 1st, 1889, was an eventful date in the annals of British history. The long wars in Europe were over. Her Majesty Queen Victoria sat upon the throne of England, and the British Empire virtually surrounded the globe. England was at her glory. On this trip, the Renown was unlikely to meet up with hostile ships from either Spain or France, and pirate ships would pass by this 48-gun war machine. This was a trip to conduct business with settlers in Australia. Fresh British soldiers were aboard, as were supplies to maintain those soldiers. But more importantly, the HMS Renown was carrying 50 prisoners from Newgate Prison in London. These 50 unlucky individuals were being shipped to Australia, and there they would be put to work on the farms of the settlers who had preceded them to that foreign and rugged shore. Most of these poor souls had been put in prison because they had debts they could not pay. There were among them several whom, by our standards, we would call children. These were street urchins caught for pickpocketing or snitching fruit from the stands in the Central Market. Both boys and girls, dressed in tattered rags and looking as if they had not had a bath in 6 months, were aboard. Some of the grown women on board attempted to mother these youngsters, but they were too rowdy to listen to an older adult. Some of them had been on the streets fighting and scraping to stay alive since they were 5 years old. They were as tough as nails and twice as sassy. It was not normal for a ship to leave harbor so late in the winter, but necessity required that these troops reach Australia before the early spring planting season. So Captain Goforth ordered that the ship be made ready and provisions laid in for a 3-month journey, which would begin, he knew, under the threat of high wind and icy gales. He had been at sea in such weather before, but never with women and children aboard, and thus he was a bit anxious. He could not afford to lose a single soul on this passage, so he had ordered extra blankets and provisions. Captain Goforth was known throughout the British Navy as a stern but caring officer, and seamen who served under him were heard to say that they would rather sail under good old Goforth than any other captain in the ranks. There was another difference on this cruise. Captain Goforth's personal cabin boy was no longer with him. His 12-year hitch in the Navy had come to an end, and when they made port last fall, he wished the captain goodbye and left His Majesty's service. He was tired of having to live on a moving, undulating deck most of his life. What he wanted most of all was a farm, and so he had saved up his poor pay and eagerly awaited until his hitch was up so he could go to Scotland and live on solid land. Now Captain Goforth had a new cabin boy. This youngster was barely 13 years old. He had entered the Navy on his 12th birthday and had spent the next year learning the duties of a cabin boy on one of Her Majesty's training ships. At last he was ready, and when Captain Goforth requested a new cabin boy from the Office of Naval Services, this is what was sent him. Percy was a scrawny redhead, barely 5 feet tall, but he was quick and alert and eager to please. So Captain Goforth made up his mind that he was going to like this young lad. Perhaps if all went well, he would be able to keep this youngster for 12 years, and by that time it would be time for him to retire as well. On Percy's side, there was a certain amount of anxiety. He had never really been to sea yet. All of his training had been done on a dry-docked frigate kept permanently moored at dockside. Now he would have a chance to get his sea legs. He really did not know what to expect, so it was only natural to have a little anxiety. What being that he was not only going to have to get used to a rocking ship, but he was going to have to learn the ways of a new captain. Now he would find out if they had taught him the proper things back on the training ship. As I mentioned, They sailed from the safety of Portsmouth Harbor and into the Channel with the early morning tide on December 1st, 1889. Percy was too busy to worry about waving goodbye to anyone on dock. He really didn't have anyone. His mother had died when he was 10, and his father, a butcher in Marylebone section of London, had remarried. His new stepmother made it quite clear she did not want Percy or his older brother Charles around the house. They weren't hers, and she did not want them underfoot. Thus it was that when Charles reached 12 years of age, his father took him down to the recruitment office of the 3rd Brigadiers and enrolled him as a drummer boy. It was not long before he shipped off to South Africa to help maintain the peace and fight the Boers who wanted to get rid of British rule. When Percy reached the ripe old age of 12, his father, Walter, took him down to the Bureau of the Navy and enrolled him in the cabin boy training program. That first year of training was not too bad. He got to go home on holidays, but he knew he wasn't welcome. Besides, his father and his new wife had 2 daughters, and there was really no place for Percy to sleep. So you see, there wasn't any loved one on the dock to wave goodbye to. Percy was all alone in the world. But come to think about it, he really wasn't alone. The uniform he wore each morning at the raising of the colors reminded him that he was part of a larger family. His family now consisted of rugged old sea dogs and sleazy, slit-eyed sea warriors. Many of them had lived through battles that would have sunk a lesser ship. Their wounds, one eye gone, an arm with a hook on the end of it instead of a hand, a leg, a wooden peg instead of a leg, hideous scars on almost every part of the body, and of course, tattoos, lots of tattoos. But they were his family now. And at the head of the family was the patriarch, Sir Henry Goforth, captain of Her Majesty's ship, the HMS Renown. No sooner had the Renown cleared the currents of Portsmouth Harbor and collided with the icy currents of the English Channel than Percy began to wonder why in the world he had chosen the Navy. Indeed, it had been a choice, for his father had offered to take him down to the same recruiting station that he had taken his brother Charles. But no, Percy had a restlessness within him, and he wanted to sail the seas and experience as much of the world as possible. In the Army, he thought, the most you got to see of the world was mud and dirt. You did not get to see the world, so the Navy was the place for him. The first week out of port was a time of blistering ice storms. The captain and the crew fought day and night to keep the ship headed toward the southern hemisphere. Part of his duties was to make sure that the criminals down in the hull of the ship were supplied with daily provisions of food and water. He was to report to the captain and the ship's surgeon if there was even a hint of sickness among the prisoners. It was in doing his duties that Percy struck up a conversation with several of the young boys on board who were his own age. Each had been snatched off the streets of London and without so much as a fair trial were herded aboard the Renown and destined for a life of hard work in the colonies. Percy had seen many of these types back on the streets in the marketplaces of Marylebone. Percy began to think about his own plight. 12 years in the British Navy was certainly better than being deported to a far-off colony to do 7 years of hard labor. Percy quit feeling sorry for himself and began to understand that his father had done his best for his 2 sons. 10 days at sea, bucking the gales and the salty ice, and on the 11th day, Percy awoke with the piping of the 5th hour. It was still dark on board as he climbed the ladder and surveyed the horizon. The sea was quiet, and the billowing sails were stretched tight by the pressing wind. A twisting wake was stretched out behind the stern of the Renown as it glided effortlessly through the water. "Master Percy," a voice shouted out in the darkness. "Aye, sir," came the response, for he recognized his captain's voice. "Report at once, Master Percy," the voice came back. Even before the words were lost to the wind, Percy was moving across the dark weather deck and up the ladder to the captain's deck, saluting as he came to a halt in front of Captain Goforth. "Master Percy, it seems as if we've outrun the gales and today should be easy sailing. I believe that we're about 5 days from Gibraltar. We shall replenish our water supplies there and then head for the Azores. In the meantime, Master Percy, I should like for you to bring the prisoners up on deck so that they might stretch and exercise. Some may need to be dunked in the sea for a bath. See to it, Master Percy." "Aye, aye, sir," responded the young cabin boy, and off he sprinted, down the ladder to the weather deck, past the mast of the mainsail, and down the ladder into the hull of the ship. As the sun poked its head over the edge of the sea, small groups of prisoners ascended the ladder and stood unsteadily on the gently rocking deck. They had been cramped in the lower hull where standing was not even possible and where sanitary conditions were unheard of. Now they stretched their muscles and flexed their arms and legs. The sun beat down on them like tiny sparks from a fire. It felt so good to be able to move and stretch and feel the warmth. Each day, for about an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon, the prisoners were brought up on deck. They were allowed to wash their clothes, and many of them were slung on over the side in a halter and drenched in the seawater, their first bath in many months. On the 24th day at sea, Captain Goforth once again called Percy to him. "Master Percy, do you know what tomorrow is, sir?" "I'm not sure, Captain. I'm not very good with dates." "Good Lord, young man, tomorrow's Christmas, and we shall celebrate it in style," Captain Goforth continued. "Master Percy, please instruct the cook that tomorrow will be a feast day, and that we shall all celebrate Christmas together in style." Percy left the captain and found the cook on the main deck with a brazier of hot charcoal preparing the midday meal. He had to force himself to eat the oat gruel that the cook called stew, but he knew that if he did not eat, he would soon become sick, and so he ate the stuff in silence, remembering the meals that he had had back in Marylebone. His heart beat hard with thoughts of home and fresh meat from his father's market. Oh, how he would love to have a piece of fresh meat, cooked slowly in an open fireplace. Or how about some of the bread, homemade bread? Even his grouchy stepmother made good bread. He missed that about her. But for now, it was gruel, with who knows what thrown in. Christmas morning broke fair and clear across the bowsprit of the Renown. Percy heard the pipes sounding the 7th hour. The voice of the first mate sounded over the lightly lapping waves against the hull of the ship as it continued on track to the south. "All hands on deck," came the voice. "All hands on deck." And the crew of 60 men popped their heads through the bulwark and emerged on the weather deck. Most of them did not know and did not care what day it was. Captain Goforth turned to Percy and made a simple gesture, pointing to the ladder that led down into the hall. Percy knew what he meant, and he scurried down to instruct the prisoners to come above. As they emerged, their eyes needed to adjust to the bright light, and as they did, they discovered a table spread with all manner of fruits and nuts, and off to the side a barrel of grog. The captain removed his hat and spoke. "I do not know how many of you follow the Christian ways, but on this ship we remember from whence we get our daily strength." He turned to an old salt sitting next to him and said, "Take your hat off, man. This is Christmas." Then turning toward the prisoners, huddled to one side of the deck, he continued, "Today, for this one day, you are no longer prisoners. Today you will celebrate with us. There is food for all, and we will have a very special treat. Just before we left port, I encountered a butcher from Marylebone who presented me with 4 of the finest cured hams I've ever seen. Master Percy, front and center, if you would, please." Percy presented himself to the captain with a half-hearted salute and a quizzical look on his face. "Am I to believe that your father is a butcher in Marylebone, and that he enlisted you in the Navy to get you out from underfoot?" It was all Percy could do to stand there and not shed a tear. He ached for the warmth of Christmases back home, the Christmases he celebrated before he went into the Navy. But he did not cry. "Well, Master Percy, I believe it was your father, and he instructed me to break these hams out for a celebration on Christmas Day. And so we will." And Percy received the greatest gift he had ever received at Christmas time. No, it wasn't the ham. It was a feeling of knowing deep down inside himself that his father really loved him and wished him well. What more could a boy ask for on Christmas Day, sailing upon the high seas?